August 1944. The German front in France was supposed to be bending, not breaking. Maps and division headquarters still showed solid blue lines, defensive positions, fallback routes, neatly drawn in pencil, arrows, timings, reserves. On paper, the story was still one of organized withdrawal, controlled delay, disciplined resistance. On those same roads, in the dust and exhaust of a collapsing army, German officers were sending very different reports. British tanks are everywhere. They were appearing on roads that had been marked as clear, bursting from side lanes that were supposed to be blocked, showing up behind rearguard positions that, on paper, were safe. Columns being shelled from directions where no Allied armor was supposed to exist yet. Messages came in over clogged radio nets, half shouted, yet half drowned by static and engine noise. To staff officers hunched over those maps, it sounded like panic. To the men on the ground, it felt like something worse. It felt like the British armor was outrunning the war itself. Intelligence summaries scrambled to make sense of it. Field reports spoke of fast British cruisers cutting roads and smashing convoys, then being sighted again hours later far beyond where they had any right to be. The only way higher command could explain what units were seeing was simple. The British must have slipped an entire armored division through the lines, equipped with some new, unusually quick tank that the charts didn't account for. They were half right. There was no new division. There was a new kind of tank. It sat low in the hedgerow lanes, almost shy, with a flat turret and a squat hull, often half hidden by dust and foliage. It didn't look like a monster. There was no towering silhouette like a tiger, no hulking bulk like a panther, no brutal, slab-sided menace that screamed heavy tank to every observer who glimpsed it through binoculars. What it had instead was a heart stolen from the sky. The British called it the Cromwell. The Cromwell didn't start in a tank design office. It started in a fighter plane. For years, British engineers had built the Merlin engine, the V12 that had carried Spitfires and Hurricanes into the Battle of Britain. The sound of that engine had become the soundtrack of survival over English towns and fields. When they needed power for a new cruiser tank, they did something radical. They took the Merlin, stripped off the supercharger, simplified the design, and turned it into the Meteor, a 600 horsepower, petrol-hungry, battle-ready V12. Then they bolted it into a 27-ton steel box. They didn't just swap engines. They changed the philosophy of what a British tank could be. Earlier, cruisers had been underpowered, stretched to keep up with doctrine. With the Meteor, for the first time, the engine had more to give than the hull could comfortably take. On paper, that gave the Cromwell something no German planner believed possible: the power-to-weight ratio of a racing car in a medium tank. 40 miles per hour on roads. For a tank of its day, that number didn't look real. It was fast enough to sound like a typo in a briefing. Fast enough that when someone wrote it into a report, a skeptical colonel might circle it in red pencil and add a question mark in the margin. Fast enough that test drivers came back from factory trials grinning, shaken, and quietly worried about the suspension. But in Normandy's lanes and French open country, that number stopped being ink. It started becoming wrecks. To understand why the Cromwell was different, you have to understand how the British thought about tanks. They didn't see them as one family. They saw two. On one side were the infantry tanks, Churchills, heavy, thick-skinned brawlers that lumbered forward with the foot soldiers crawling over craters and walls, shrugging off fire while they punched holes in strong points. They were slow, deliberate, patient machines. They advanced like rolling fortresses. On the other side were the cruisers. Cruiser tanks were not supposed to sit and trade blows, yet they were the cavalry of the machine age. The fast riders sent charging deep beyond the broken front into supply lines and headquarters, tearing the nervous system out of an army that still thought it had time to reorganize. Their armor could be thinner, their profile lower, their comfort secondary. What mattered was speed, range, and the ability to keep moving when others had to stop. The Cromwell was the purest cruiser the British had ever built. Everything about it whispered one word: speed. Its armor was honest about that choice. Around 60-odd millimeters at the nose, a little more on the turret face, enough to deflect small-caliber guns, enough to turn glancing shots, enough to survive if the driver stayed clever and the commander kept his crew out of obvious kill zones. Not enough to sit and duel a panther at 300 yards and expect to win. The gun, a 75mm, was chosen for flexibility. It could fire armor-piercing rounds at tanks and high explosive at infantry and soft targets, a compromise weapon, but one that finally gave British crews something they'd long lacked: the ability to fight tanks and support infantry with the same barrel, without relying entirely on special Fireflies for heavy anti-tank work. But the real weapon wasn't in the barrel. It was in the right foot of the driver. At top speed, a Cromwell could cover nearly 60 feet of ground every second. 60 feet. Every second. Now put that beside the enemy. The Panzer IV, the backbone of many German armored formations, used an electric turret drive that, under ideal conditions, it could swing the gun a full circle in just over 20 seconds. Other vehicles relied on manual traverse when power failed, turning hand wheels with sweating arms as the target tried not to hold still. In theory, those numbers were decent. In practice, battles don't happen at ideal. Tanks fight in broken ground, at awkward angles, under fire, with drivers stopping and starting, engines throttling up and down. Turrets pause to adjust aim. Loaders shout. Commanders change orders at the last moment when they spot a new threat. Even in good conditions, tracking a fast, laterally moving target at several hundred yards with a 20-second 360-degree traverse was a problem. When that target could shift 60 feet sideways every second, that problem became a nightmare, because the Cromwell had two kinds of speed. Yes, its turret was fast enough to keep up with most threats, but its hull, its ability to change where it was on the map, was faster than many German crews could mentally process. The entire tank could sidestep the enemy's line of fire in the time it took a gunner to inhale and adjust his aim. That was the invisible weapon. On range tables, the German tanks had impressive numbers: armor thickness, penetration at 1,000 meters, muzzle velocity. They were engineered to dominate static engagements, to win the contest of who could punch through whom at long range. Nothing on those tables measured how it felt to swing your sights onto a British cruiser tank, only to see it vanish behind a barn and reappear 300 feet further down the hedgerow before your loader had even slammed home the next round. Nothing on those tables measured what it did to a crew's nerves when every time they thought they had trapped a British tank, it simply wasn't there anymore. The Cromwell first showed its teeth in Normandy. It went to war with some of the most famous units in the British Army: the 7th Armoured Division, the old Desert Rats of North Africa, and the Armoured Reconnaissance Regiments of the Guards and 11th Armoured Divisions. Crews who had once chased Rommel across open desert now found themselves squeezed into narrow bocage lanes, their fast cruisers reduced to cautious, gear-grinding crawls. Their job at first wasn't glorious. It was confusing. Normandy was not desert. The hedgerows came right up to the barrels. Fields were small, enclosed, broken by sunken lanes and stone farmhouses that had seen centuries of peace before the war finally came to their doors. The ground swallowed vision. Enemy guns could be 20 meters away and completely hidden behind dirt and leaves. In those tight spaces, Cromwells couldn't always use their speed. A fast tank with nowhere to run becomes just another target. Operations like Goodwood and Blue Coat taught painful lessons. Advancing over open ground under German 88s and dug-in Panthers showed that no matter how good your engine is, if the plan pins you in the gun sights of a prepared enemy, velocity only buys you seconds. And sometimes those seconds are not enough. Columns of Cromwells and Shermans burned in French fields, their black smoke columns rising above the hedgerows. Crews learned to fear invisible guns. It's to distrust open ground, to creep forward behind rolling barrages and plumes of dust. Cromwell crews died in burning tanks, just like men in Shermans and Churchills and Panthers. Speed didn't make them invincible. But war changes shape. And in August 1944, the shape of the war in France changed overnight. The German front that was supposed to bend finally snapped. The Falaise Pocket began to close. German divisions that had once marched forward in tight formations now retreated in long, ragged streams of vehicles, all trying to escape east before the jaws shut. Dust clouds marked their routes by day. Columns of smoke from burning fuel and abandoned vehicles marked their failures. That's when the Cromwell found its environment. Not hedgerow ambush, pursuit. British High Command gave orders the cruiser crews had been waiting for. A breakout. Push east, cut roads, take crossings, don't let them rest. The 11th Armoured Division, with Cromwells and its leading reconnaissance units, suddenly discovered what their tanks were really built for. They weren't just advancing, they were racing. Timetables from that period read less like battle plans and more like endurance rally schedules. Units were expected to cover dozens of miles in a day, sometimes pushing towards 70 as they leapfrogged, seized bridges, and tried to stay ahead of a fleeing enemy. Fuel columns and maintenance crews fought their own battles to keep up with the pace. Inside the Cromwells, the war felt different. Imagine the view from the turret of a Cromwell in one of those spearhead patrols. The hatch is open. The air is hot and full of dust, and the sweet, sharp smell of crushed crops. Yes, the Meteor engine behind you is a constant physical presence, a deep hammering vibration coming up through the hull floor and into the soles of your boots, thrumming through your chest. The radio crackles and hisses, call signs and grid references snapping in your ears. Names of villages you've never heard of, crossroads you're supposed to reach before a certain hour. Reports of enemy movement somewhere ahead. The road ahead snakes between trees and stone houses. Somewhere out there beyond the bend is a German column that still thinks it has an hour before Allied tanks can possibly reach this point. Your squadron leader's voice comes over the radio, clipped and calm, marking waypoints, warning of possible anti-tank positions. Advance with caution is said, make speed is implied. Then you see them, trucks first. Always the trucks. Canvas-topped, packed with men and crates and fuel. Helmets bobbing as they bounce over ruts. Some soldiers sitting with their legs dangling from the back. Rifles slung. Faces turned towards the long road home they hope to find. Half-tracks, cars, gun tractors towing 88s and field pieces. A couple of tanks, further back, hulls dusty. Crews riding exposed, tired and careless. Uniforms unbuttoned in the August heat. Your driver doesn't slow down. Your tank doesn't form a neat line on the road and grind forward into the tail of the column. You swing off, cutting the angle, sliding into a field that parallels the German line of march. The Cromwell's suspension bucks and sways, but the engine doesn't complain. Tracks tear through crops. Dust and leaves whip past the hull. Now you're not behind them. You're beside them. That you can see the side armor of their vehicles, the soft flanks of their logistics, the thin steel of fuel bowsers, men in the back of trucks turning, mouths opening in surprise, as they register what's pacing them out of the corner of their eye. Right truck. Fire! The 75mm barks. The first shell hits a fuel vehicle, punching in low and detonating the cargo. A mushroom of black smoke and orange flame forces the column to break. Men dive from the backs of trucks, some too slow, falling into ditches as burning fuel spills across the road and clings to anything that touches it. In the German tanks, commanders shout for traverses. Turrets begin to swing. Crews that had been half asleep jolt into motion. Loaders slam shells into breaches with panicked hands. But your tank is already moving again. You've fired, slewed, And your driver has put his foot down before the smoke from your first shot has even cleared. In the seconds it takes a panzer turret to chase where you were, you've shifted 100, maybe 200 feet down the line, gun realigning for the next target. A gun tractor, a half-track bristling with infantry, an ammunition truck waiting its turn to explode. To the Germans, it feels unreal. They saw you at one point. They're being hit from another. By the time their gunners find you, you've ducked back behind a farmhouse or a row of trees to emerge again somewhere else, hammering the column in slices. What looks like multiple enemy troops might, in reality, be the same handful of Cromwells, using speed and angles to seem like an entire regiment. You're not just firing at them. Yet you're cutting the idea of rear and front to pieces. For the soldiers in the column, the sense of direction dissolves. There is no safe side. Shells come from the hedgerow, from the field, from the village they thought was friendly ground. The road that was supposed to lead them out becomes a killing lane they are too slow to leave. The Cromwell was never meant to be the queen of the battlefield. It was meant to be the knight. Fast, dangerous, hard to catch, striking where the enemy wasn't looking, turning withdrawal into rout. As the pursuit rolled east towards the Seine, that is exactly what it did. Day after day, Cromwell-equipped units were reported further east than anyone expected. Messages arrived at German headquarters describing British tanks at junctions that, according to yesterday's reports, should still have been in German hands. They seized junctions before German engineers could blow them. They arrived at bridges that German commanders had assumed would be safe for at least another day. Sometimes British tanks and German demolition teams reached the same span within minutes of each other. Who controlled the bridge came down to who had moved faster that morning. In some cases, Cromwells and their riders reached crossings up to 2 days ahead of other Allied formations that had started the breakout from roughly the same line. The cruisers were not waiting for the main body. They were pulling it forward, dragging the front line along behind them like a flapping banner. For the Germans, that speed broke more than just plans. It broke confidence. When headquarters staff can't trust their maps, when they can't assume that a road marked clear will still be clear 3 hours later, when their phone lines crackle with reports of fast British tanks in places that don't make sense, a psychological tipping point is reached. An army stops thinking about how to hold. It starts thinking about how to escape. The pursuit was not clean. Cromwell crews paid for their aggression in sweat, nerves, and blood. Running a Meteor at high revs over bad roads for days at a time was brutal on the machine. Track pins shook loose. Suspension units groaned. Gearboxes demanded constant attention. Engines, pushed hard and often, drank fuel at alarming rates, turning supply into a constant worry. When they halted, sometimes in captured villages lit by the glow of distant burning fuel dumps, Cromwell crews didn't sleep. And they dropped off the hulls with toolboxes. They lay on their backs beneath hot steel, faces smeared with oil, hands numb, checking links, tightening bolts, changing road wheels under hurried lamplight, knowing that a breakdown at the wrong moment tomorrow could mean being caught without the one advantage their tank truly had: motion. They learned to listen to their tank as much as to their radios, to feel a new vibration, hear a new rattle, sense when something was about to fail and fix it before it turned into a stranded hull on a vital road. And when pursuit took them into terrain or situations where they couldn't move, they took casualties. An 88 doesn't care how fast your tank is if you're silhouetted on a ridge. A Panther in ambush doesn't care about your horsepower if you drive, unknowingly, across its sights. Mines don't care how quick you were going the moment before you rolled over them. The Cromwell was not magic, it was a compromise. Thin enough in places that a hit from a high-velocity gun could punch straight through. Fast enough that if you used it the way it was meant to be used, you could avoid being hit at all. That was the ugly truth the crews lived with. Their tank gave them a chance, no more. And that chance depended on them driving like demons, thinking like cavalrymen, and trusting that if they kept moving, The enemy would always be a half-second behind. By the time the British armor reached the Seine, the race was all but won. German units that escaped did so as fragments, their convoys chewed down, their guns abandoned by the roadside, their commanders forced to take longer, slower routes to avoid the fast. The low silhouettes that kept appearing like ghosts at crossroads they thought were safe. The Cromwell didn't win the war alone. No tank did. But it carved its signature into that crucial period with something that didn't fit neatly into a spec sheet: operational tempo. After the war, the Cromwell didn't stick around for long. Technologies leapt forward. The British moved to the Comet, then to the Centurion, the first of a new breed of main battle tanks that blended firepower, protection, and mobility into a single, heavy, fully modern package. The old cruiser philosophy faded. The Army wanted tanks that could do everything, not specialists built for a dash. The Cromwell became a footnote, a few in museums, a few in training, a name on plaques and memorials. But the lesson it wrote across the roads of France didn't vanish. On paper, the Tiger and Panther looked better. Their guns were bigger, their armor thicker, their silhouettes more imposing. They dominated stats and terrified enemies who had to face them head-on. Those numbers never measured what happened when a 27-ton cruiser chose not to play by their rules. They didn't measure a tank that could slide out of a kill zone in the time it took an enemy commander to finish a sentence. They didn't account for a squadron that could cover 40 miles while a staff officer updated yesterday's situation report. They didn't quantify what it did to an army's mind when its rear areas, its supposed safety, were suddenly full of fast, aggressive tanks that appeared on flanks and crossings like they'd been dropped there by mistake. On a firing range, the big German cats were kings. Yet on the open roads of Normandy and northern France, where the front line blurred and distance became the real weapon, the Cromwell proved something different. You don't have to be the biggest tank on the battlefield. You don't always have to be the most heavily armored or the one with the longest gun. Sometimes you just have to be the tank that can be somewhere else before the enemy finishes turning his turret. And in August 1944, racing through the dust and smoke of a retreating army, that's exactly what the British Cromwell did, one fast, low silhouette at a time.